Chag Sameach, Shabbat Shalom. On the first day of Rosh Hashanah, I talked about love, and some of my reflections were focused on the special nature of that bond between parents and children. Tonight, Kol Nidre, is a night when we speak about the nature of sacred promises, and so perhaps it is appropriate that I talk about another major flavor of loving relationships, based not on blood, but on promises, that of marriage. It's been a number of years that I have been toying with giving this sermon, but it seems particularly important this year because I see more and more marriages in our community struggling and even, I dare say, failing. It should go without saying that Judaism values marriage. In an ideal world, partnership brings joy. In Bereshit, when God creates the world, each time he makes something new, light, the sun and moon, birds and fish, it says that he declared them tov, ki tov. The first time that we hear the opposite is after God created human beings, and God shows him all the animals, the walrus, the raccoon, the pygmy hippopotamus, but none of them is a match. God sees that the first human is existentially alone. And God says, lo tov, it's not good that a person be alone. The primordial human is split into male and female, who complete each other by being a united couple. In modern times, in the approach to Judaism in which I place myself, we understand that expression of levado to apply to relationships that expand in gender beyond those anticipated by Bereshit. It's not that we've erased the verses in Leviticus, we'll still read them tomorrow, but we understand that God's value judgment in Genesis takes priority. So tonight I want to talk to you about marriage. I want to talk to you about the 4 F's, the things that trip up marriages, and the 5 love languages that keep them together. And I'll touch on what happens when that's not enough, and perhaps what that means for all of us as we enter this holy day, this Yom Kippur. And I have to offer some important disclaimers. The first is that finding an appropriate partner is hard. In Psikta Rav Kahana, there's the story, a Roman matron asked Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta, so how many days did it take to create the world? Took 6 days. And the matron says, great, so what's he been doing since then? What have you done for me lately, God? Rabbi Yossi says he's been arranging marriages. This one goes with that one with the other one. The matron says, that's easy. I have manservants and maidservants. In a moment, I can couple them up. Rabbi Yossi said, you think arranging marriages is so easy? For God, it is a greater miracle than splitting the Red Sea. So Rabbi Yossi left, and the matron took 1,000 of her male slaves, 1,000 of her female slaves, and stood them row by row and said, you go with you go with you, and matched them up. Now today, I think there actually is a reality show of that. But this was the Talmud, and no one had a keen eye for marketing tie-ins. And so in the morning they came, they brought the servants out, and this one had a head wound, this one's eye was knocked out, this one had a broken leg, this one said, I don't want her, I don't want him. She sent for Rabbi Yossi, and he came, and she said, you have a point there, your Torah is true. And so there are some for whom marriage is not the right choice, or who may want very much to be married and feel the pain of not being able to find the right partner, or perhaps found a partner they thought was right who was not. Today, there's a reason why there are a gazillion dating apps. But we are told in ancient times, Yom Kippur afternoon was one of the most joyous times. Tomorrow afternoon, after a day of fasting, the young people would go out into the fields and dance, and matches would be made. Today, I think there are ways in which we make it harder on ourselves. One of the hottest shows on Netflix is called Nobody Wants This. Now, I've only watched a couple of minutes. I promised my wife I would wait. But you can already tell that it plays in stereotypes. Now, some of them are 100% accurate, like the idea that rabbis are attractive and charming. But others are harmful and really play into biases and expectations that we have culturally about Jewish men and Jewish women that really make it harder for us to find partners. If you're one of those people here tonight coming from a place of pride or a place of pain or a place of, look, I'm a long way off from that, and saying this sermon does not apply to me personally, I acknowledge that. But what it means to maintain, to sustain, to strengthen, to repair a relationship is something that is universal. And perhaps the flip side is true. There are some of us for whom this sermon is all too accurate and real. And I'm not here to second guess the choices or the paths that anyone has taken in life. And perhaps if we have the wisdom from the school of hard knocks, that is wisdom that we ourselves can share. Another very important caveat. The story is told of a rabbi who has written a sermon about sailing. And before he leaves the house on Saturday morning, he shows a copy to his wife, who finds it less than stellar. And so as he is sitting there, the Haftorah is going, he is struck by inspiration. He puts down his written words, and he decides to ad-lib and offers stunning remarks on sex and intimacy in our Jewish tradition. He makes them laugh, he makes them cry, he makes them think. His wife shows up a little bit later, just in time for Kiddush, and the congregants are abuzz, talking about the rabbi's remarkable words. Your sermon, that rabbi's sermon was amazing. Thinking back to what she read that morning, she scoffs. What does he know? He's only done it twice. One time he threw up, and the other time his kippah blew away. So I don't hold myself up as an exemplar. Some of the words you'll hear me present most convincingly this evening are words that I myself need to be reminded of from time to time. I also want to note that although I have a lot of folksy wisdom, I am not a trained social worker or psychologist. I actually often joke that I am something like the school nurse. I am often able to diagnose problems that I am neither qualified to treat or prescribe for. But often what you need when you're hurting is a hug and something over the counter, at least to keep you going. So with those warnings in mind, let's dive in. When couples run into trouble, that trouble tends to come through what I like to refer to as the 4 F's: faith, finances, family, and let's say physical intimacy. Oh, that's PH, I'm sorry. Now, I think the reason why those categories are the hardest is because those are the areas where it's hardest to compromise. If I like the beach and you like to ski, water skiing might satisfy neither of us, but we can go to the coast one year, the mountains the next. If I am messy and you are neat, or the converse, you can bring someone in to clean. If I love my mother and you hate my mother, that's harder to overcome. If you spend $1 one place, I can't spend it somewhere else. And I don't know if it has ever turned out well when someone said, fine, you have sex, I'm gonna sit here and watch Netflix. When we think about those challenging areas in more depth, we understand that they apply more broadly than you might think. So faith, narrowly defined, we could say, is about religion. And we know that marriages where people are of different backgrounds, religious and ethnic, on average have a higher divorce rate. There's just something else that you take as fundamental that may be harder to overcome. And even when both partners come from a similar background, sometimes the smallest things, raisin challah, no raisin challah, rice on Passover, no rice on Passover, can be overwhelming. But it's not just about religion. It could be other dearly held core beliefs. Some of you remember James Carville and Mary Madeline, a staunch Democrat, the ragin' Cajun, and a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. They managed to make it work. It did not go as well for George and Kellyanne. The second F is finances. Now, there's no doubt that financial instability causes stress in a household. When I meet with couples who are getting married, I try to get them thinking about what they have to do to get themselves on a firm footing. Have a budget, see a financial planner. But some of the worst fights I have seen are between couples who frankly had more money than they needed and still did not know what to do with it. Because more basically, when those disagreements happen, they are not about the dollar signs, but about values. What is worth it and what is a waste? Do we work harder? Do we spend more time together? Do we invest in things? Do we invest in experiences? Do we spend now? Do we save for later? And then there's family. God says, Lo tov, it's not good for a man to be alone. And God says about Adam, therefore a man must leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. This is remarkable because, in fact, Eve is the only woman in history to not have a mother-in-law. It was like being in the Garden of Eden. Jewish parents and children, I know it will shock you to hear, sometimes have complex and entangled relationships. What? It is sometimes a stretch for parents to realize that their children are now part of a new household. Wait, you guys share a bedroom? And marriage is creating a single unit. And by the way, the challenge goes the other way. If as a couple you are complaining about your spouse to your parents or your siblings, you may forgive your spouse. Your parents, your siblings will not. The challenge of family goes in the other direction. Children are a blessing, but they are also their own form of birth control. And there are all kinds of ways that couples can be challenged in raising them. And by the way, in the research that has been done, having a child who is troubled, a child who has a chronic condition or illness, or even, God forbid, passes away, is as great a stress on a marriage as anything else that can happen. And the final F, physical intimacy. Everyone in the room will be relieved to hear I'm not going to go into detail tonight. I will say that the challenges of intimacy are different perhaps than what they used to be. My father of blessed memory was a rabbi, served for over 40 years. And when he was doing an intake, he was meeting with a couple, we're going to do a wedding. He had a form he liked to use. There was a spot for the groom's parents' address. There was one for the bride's parents' address. And then there was an optional spot for where the groom lived and where the bride lived. Nowadays, more often than not, the bride and groom share an address, and their parents are living apart. And so what happens is that people used to at least pretend that something new, exciting, different was going to happen on the wedding night. Nowadays, the biggest surprise is something like, look at this check from Aunt Edna. Who knew? I suppose there are positives to that. And at least most couples I meet with, that's an aspect of their relationship they have worked out. Or so they think. Because people come into relationships with unreasonable expectations. Their new partner has to compete with everything that has come before. And there's all that we are presented with in the media, let alone on the internet, on TV. Sex somehow manages to take just long enough to get you to the commercial break. Everyone looks great afterwards. The carriage fogs up at just the right moment. And then they have these sheets that come up to here or to here, depending on how the show is rated. Another challenge is that the early stages of a relationship, there's a thrill of the chase. As human beings, there's this very deep part of our brain that is enthralled, that is drawn to the new and the novel. Something that's familiar or always just kind of around doesn't have the same effect. That local neighborhood restaurant may have great food, but it's somehow much more exciting to snag a reservation at that place that you can't get a reservation to. There's the story of a rabbi who counsels a couple who are getting married. Says, if you're going to be part of this community, if you want me to marry you, I'm going to need you to practice abstinence, at least until our next meeting. And the couple comes back 2 weeks later. He asks, how did it go? Well, you see, we were doing really well. And then about 10 days in, I saw my fiance was reaching up to the shelf to grab a can. And the next thing, right then and there, and sorry. The rabbi replied, I'm very disappointed in you. I'm afraid you're not welcome at our synagogue. Well, we're not welcome now at Kroger either. Going to let that. There is, and some of you may know this, a part of our Jewish tradition, Jewish practice, where couples will actually separate for part of the month and then use the mikveh before coming back together. And there are aspects of this practice that are challenging, perhaps practically or philosophically, but one thing that it does is it forces couples to attune to the cadences of emotional and physical intimacy in the relationship, and to appreciate that they should not take it for granted. I can't tell you how often I'll be working with a couple, and the conversation goes something like this. Well, I would be more willing to be physically intimate if you were more emotionally open. Well, I would be more emotionally open if you were more physically goes on like that. And the answer is that someone has to go first. And maybe once they get the wheel to turn a little bit, the other partner is willing to push as well, and somehow you are building up momentum. If everyone waits for someone else to take the first step, you go nowhere. Now, by the way, I think these principles apply to other relationships as well. We fight with our family and friends about money. I know a lot of people who aren't talking to each other because they have different feelings about politics, which is in some ways our new American religion. And there are definitely people who are in a struggle, who are in conflict and say, I am not going to step out, they have to make the first move. I see a lot of couples where there is fear of conflict. Now, it's actually okay to have a certain amount of conflict in marriage. If nothing your partner does or says ever annoys you, either you are married to someone as wonderful as Wendy, or you are not paying very close attention like me. Conflict, as you can see, conflict actually means that you are engaged with each other. And by the way, there are couples who scream and stomp around and yell, and then they make up even more flamboyantly. You do not want to live downstairs from those people. But they often stay married a long time. The worst thing for a marriage is when you ask, so how are things going? Fine. And the biggest avoidable mistake I see is couples not attending to warning signs. Multiple times a year, I'll have someone walk into my office. A few months ago, my partner suggested we go into counseling, but I didn't think we needed it. And now they're moving out. Or we were thinking about it, but it was so expensive. I'm reminded of the story of a man who comes to his wife, honey, I'd like to get you something special for our 30th anniversary. What would you like? She responds, a divorce. He says, I understand, but I really wasn't planning on spending that much. Counseling is expensive by the hour, but divorce attorneys charge more, and you need 2 of them. Often couples have a window where they are struggling, and there is an opportunity to turn the ship. And if you miss that window, it's too late. And by the way, in my experience, couples that manage to work it through, which actually happens a couple times a year, people walk into my office and it's tough, and I actually somehow, if only because they don't want to fight in front of the rabbi, they manage to work it out. And the magic moment is not that they agree on the answers to their questions. It's when they agree what the questions are. If one says, my spouse is ridiculous, and the other says, no, you're ridiculous, you should start looking for apartments. If you can together say, we really don't see eye to eye on this and we're troubled by it, then there's usually a way forward. So how do we overcome all of these threats to successful relationships? Well, one of my favorite marriage counselors here in Atlanta says if you want to save money on marriage counseling, spend money on having a nice dinner once a week. Another resource I find helpful is a book by Gary Chapman. It's called The 5 Love Languages. Now, he is a Christian writer, and the book comes from that perspective, but a rabbi here in Atlanta, Rabbi Mordechai Pollack, got permission to create a Jewish version. There's a global search and replace Jesus to Moses, a few other things. There's a lot of wisdom in that book. And so sometimes I'll talk to someone and I'll say, my parents didn't love me. And sometimes that might be true, but just as often, the story when you dig deeper is they were always around, but they didn't hug me enough. Or they told me that they loved me, but they were never doing what I needed. Chapman's claim is that there are 5 different ways that we express and experience affection, and that to make a relationship succeed, you have to understand what your partner and what you need. So he suggests that these 5 areas are acts of service, making dinner for someone, picking them up at the airport, gifts, and those could be little gifts, like a big diamond ring, or grand gestures, like a note in someone's backpack. Quality time, just sitting with someone. And by the way, watching TV might not count. If you are engaged in an activity with your spouse, and they could be abducted by aliens, and you wouldn't notice, and you're like, hey, you have the remote, can you skip the credits? What's that hole in the ceiling? A little more. Words of affirmation. Some people value most being told that you love them, that you are proud of them. Physical touch seems self-explanatory, but there are a lot of different kinds. But by the way, again, this goes beyond marriage. Chapman will tell you that love languages apply to every kind of relationship. He has a whole series. He has really milked this. You can think pretty easily about how gifts, quality time, words of affirmation might sustain a relationship with friends, with family. Chapman even has a book, 5 Love Languages in the Workplace. Some people are valued based on their compensation. Other people want public praise. For other people, it's knowing that the boss is paying attention to them. Look out for physical touch, or you're going to be headed for a tough meeting with HR. In fact, by the way, I would suggest that these types of relationship savers, these love languages, even affect the holiest relationship of all, and perhaps the toughest to maintain, our relationship with God. Chapman was anticipated by 3,300 years by the most important prayer of our tradition. We said it just a few minutes ago, the Shema. The second sentence begins, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. You should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. How do you command someone to love? How do you say you must love them? That doesn't work, right? That's like the Roman matron in Rabbi Yossi. You can't say you must love. But in fact, it's a prescription. If you do these things, you will love. If you invest in this relationship, there will be, you cannot help but feel connection. And so you should love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. The sages say with all your might, that is your possessions, gifts. The sages say these words will be on your heart today and you will teach them to your children. Talking about God, those are words of affirmation. When you're in your home, when you go on the way, when you lie down, when you wake up, the times when you connect with God, that's quality time. Tie them as a sign upon your hand, as tefillin, write them as a mezuzah on your doorpost. For a God who has no corporeal form, that's as close as you're going to get to physical touch. Knowing what your partner needs is incredibly important. Let's say you're late for dinner. If your partner likes gifts, they will appreciate that you ordered in something special. If they like acts of service, they would prefer that you came home and made it yourself. If they want quality time, they don't care if you're having peanut butter crackers and those little tradition soups, they just want you sitting next to them. If they want words of affirmation, they may not care if you come home at all. Just text and tell them how much you appreciate them. And the converse is, by the way, how often do we fail to express appreciation? To let our partner know, you know what, that's what I needed, and when you did that, you lifted me up. That hug, that touch, those words, that gift moved me. The Torah doesn't command us to love, it tells us how. If you do these things, if you act in ways that express love, then the emotion will follow. And that's how relationships naturally work. Real love comes as a practice of interaction and caring. Now, by the way, sometimes those things are not enough. Sometimes, despite everyone having the best of intentions, or conversely, because someone's intentions are just no good, it isn't meant to be. Now, there are some religious traditions that believe that divorce is wrong or sinful or impossible, but that's actually not Judaism. Tonight is Kol Nidre, which we think of as a night of solemn promises, and in fact, the essence of Kol Nidre is saying that we know we can't always meet our commitments. Sometimes there has to be an out. Under the chuppah, in the ketubah, the members of the couple promise, make solemn promises. And there are many mitzvot that relate to those promises. But divorce is also one of the 613. Deuteronomy 24 lays out the procedure. There's a scroll of divorce. It's handed from one to the other. The rules of writing this scroll are incredibly complex to ensure that there's no chance the divorce could be invalidated. There are witnesses. There's a Jewish court. In the Kol Nidre prayer that we recited, we made a big show of saying that we were not serious about our promises. But that great performance of communal crossing of the fingers proactively for the coming year is embedded within a day in which we are confronted existentially with the realization that we have obligations and commitments to God that we have not met. And perhaps what Kol Nidre tells us is that behind every broken commitment, behind every broken promise, there is a deeper promise that still must be kept. And that's the essence, by the way, of divorce. Divorce relieves you of the promises you made to love and honor your spouse. It does not undo the promise you made to treat your spouse with integrity. It does not undo the promises to care and provide for children. It intensifies the obligation to be beyond reproach. And so in our Jewish tradition, we realize that sometimes people are better off actually getting divorced. Divorce is hard on children, but sometimes living in a toxic environment is worse. When I look out at the crowd over these high holidays, I see every possible configuration. People who are happily married, people who are unhappily married, people who are happily remarried. Sometimes members of a couple after divorce get along better than they did when they were married. And then there are times when a room full of 1,000 people is not big enough for 2 people to be in it. And family is complicated. Few breaks are truly clean. You still have to see the in-laws at plays and games and graduations. Sometimes, by the way, in divorce, we end up with custody of relatives we had not anticipated, right? In Alabama, if you get divorced, are you still related? But I have a personal example of that. There's someone who's very dear to me, a trusted friend and advisor, who is my ex-brother-in-law's stepfather. And I think I might have spent more time with him since we weren't related than when we were. This is a night of promises. I promise I'm going to wrap this up. One more story. Moshe goes into his local post office to buy some stamps. He walks up to the counter and he sees a middle-aged man methodically sticking stamps onto a pile of pink envelopes. And he's placing little "I love you" heart stickers on the envelopes. And then he's spraying with a whiff of perfume. Moshe is very curious about this. "Why are you doing this?" The man says, "Well, I'm sending out 100 scented Valentine's Day cards, each one signed from you-know-who." "Why so many?" asked Moshe. "Because I'm a divorce lawyer, and business is not so good." I am in every kind of business. Birth, death, bar mitzvah, you name it, marriage. And unfortunately, the divorce business is a little too good right now. I have a backlog of gittin that are waiting to be written and delivered. For a long time, the story was that divorce rates in our country were dropping, but I think it's gotten worse in the last few years. Spending a year of COVID cooped up with each other reminded us of what we love about our partners and what we don't. The negativity of the last year in our own Jewish world means that we have less gas in the tank. We have less to invest in relationships. And I think it's worse because people don't know what their partner needs and don't ask, and are not willing to be open about what it is that they need. And it's even worse because people are embarrassed to ask for help when it would help. So whether it's the kind of guidance that I can offer, or the prescription strength health of seeing a good counselor, don't wait. I am not here to judge what any one person or couple has done, because we never know what goes on behind closed doors. Sometimes there is abuse that cannot be overcome. Sometimes there is a partner who has personal challenges that simply cannot be ignored. There are conflicts where only one partner or neither partner is willing to resolve. Whenever I stand under the chuppah with a couple, there's like a 40% chance that it is not going to last. And I wish that were different. This Kol Nidre night is a night of promises. It's a night of recognizing that our promises are so very sacred, but also so very fragile. Marriage is the most intense promise that one human can make voluntarily to another. When we break the glass at a wedding, it's a reminder that if a promise is broken, it is very hard to put back together. Yom Kippur, though, tells us that the nature of humanity is that sometimes we fail at our commitments to God and especially to the people we care about most. That assumption is inherent in our humanity. But God understands that, and God, more than anything else, does not want us to have to be alone, levado. Yom Kippur gives us the opportunity, and I even dare say the mandate, to look at the strength of our commitments, to strive harder, to bring not just our partners, but really everyone in our lives more integrity, more attentiveness, to be open with people about when they have let us down, and to be open with people about when they have lifted us up, and to be forgiving if they want to do better. Yom Kippur reminds us that our promises are more durable than glass, but that even when they break, our obligations remain. Gmar Chatima Tova, Shabbat Shalom.